come here to the 12th presentation of Hermetic America Future. And a presentation is distinct from a lecture. A lecture forms itself on concepts that are ultimately referential to and based on perception, whereas a presentation bases itself on circumspection, which is to make a survey of the way in which perception and conception link together to make a structure of ideas, but circumspection expands the ideas into further dimensions of meaning. And so a circumspection takes place in a different field of inquiry than does something that is a lecture based on conception, referential to perception. The field of the mind referentialing existence, ritual actions, the stuff of which we are and what we do, all of that is an integral cycle which can be brought to a completion. Any good yoga does this. Any effective contemplative practice, any meditational application can do this. The cycle of integral can be brought to its center. In Sanskrit, it's called ekagrata, single-pointedness. And with enough dynamic concentration, the Sanskrit word for that is dhyana, it evokes a new dimension of possibility. In Sanskrit, it's called prajna, which is wisdom. So a presentation expands what a lecture could do, but it has something which we have to attend to, and that is, since it is working now with an expanded field of meaning, it arranges itself not in terms of the structures of a plan, but in terms of resonances of a set. And in order to understand, one also has to appreciate the set of the resonances, and it will have a symbolic set of keys, but it will also have a harmonic, which allows for the expansion of the resonant sets, so that you begin to have a new kind of instrument. As long as music based itself on drums, on timbrels or tambourines, on flutes, on harps and lutes, it could only go so far. It had no compositional play. It had no originality. It did not ever present itself as a work of music. It only represented whatever the ritual basis was, whatever the symbolic conception was, and delivered that in a rather rote way. Thus custom, thus tribes, and thus the limitations of ideas, as long as they remain in a cycle which is only livable as long as you don't close it. Because as soon as you close the cycle, what happens naturally, integrally, is that just before that, the mind goes into an abstraction. It divorces itself from the context in which existence occurs, from the field against which experience is feeling, imaged, languaged. And when nature as a field is eliminated, the abstraction limits itself to the identification of the mind and its conceptions and the ritual comportment and its perceptions. And more plans become arid, logically sound, but they have no play. And in order to sustain themselves, they increase the intensity of the abstraction until it becomes delusionary. Because more and more, what creeps in is that the exiled nature becomes aberrant in a kind of a natural trickster saboteurship and creates more and more a referential base that is illusion. And for the mind to believe it, it goes into a delusion. And so one has a curious paradox. The further reaches of a logic is an ambiguous insanity. This was apparent by the early years of the 20th century, when Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead wrote their great 3-volume magnum opus Principia Mathematica. Like Newton's Principia for physics some 300 years before, the Principia Mathematica made it clear that a logic which is refined cannot define its own axiomatic basis. You need a separate logic in order to establish the axioms for your logic. This introduced a peculiar realization that mathematics is an art and not a conceptual discipline. And from that, Alfred North Whitehead went on to write books like Adventures in Ideas, Process and Reality. And Lord Russell went further and further into social issues. He said at one point when riding a bike in London, he realized he never again could think to the brink of fragility in preciseness that was required for a Principia Mathematica, because he had seen through it. He had seen beyond it. So this is a presentation. But the art of a presentation was refined about 2,000 years ago at the end of the 1st century AD in Alexandria. That the true set of resonances that make up the first indication that one has a harmonic which is relationable to natural cycles is to have a seasonal presentation set. And the season is a 13-weekly set. Out of this, the classic university teaching form that evolved out of that was the seminar that takes 13 weeks, the semester that takes 13 weeks, and a year will make 4 seasons of 4 presentation resonances, and that whole year then will be the harmonic, the initial harmonic of the meaning that is possible to be learned from those resonant sets. But the proviso is that one cannot take a single ideology as the key. You have to have something refined now. You have to have a number of angles of vision in order to deliver the new harmonic resonance of meaning that is possible. And one of the greatest historians of the 20th century established this in American history and literally made history by doing so. His name was Frederick Jackson Turner. Now, Turner was born in Portage, Wisconsin, which is on the Wisconsin River, north of Madison, about 40, 50 miles. And if you went further up the Wisconsin River from Portage, you would come to the beautiful Wisconsin Dells. If you come down the Wisconsin River, it swerves to the west of where Madison, the University of Wisconsin, is located. And that Wisconsin River swerves and runs through a little town called Spring Green, where Frank Lloyd Wright had Taliesin. But the road from Portage does not follow the Wisconsin River. It veers a little off to the east, and it comes down very close to another little town called Sun Prairie, where Georgia O'Keeffe grew up. And so Frederick Jackson Turner, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Frank Lloyd Wright make a triangle around the University of Wisconsin at Madison in the 19th century. And it was a time where Turner in Portage was on the edge of the still wilderness. He was surrounded by Indian tribes who still lived in Aboriginal America. And so his early work that turned out, he wrote a monograph on American Indians, the character and influence of the Indian trade in Wisconsin. And of course, he went to the University of Wisconsin, where he majored in history, which had just been set up in 1867. William Francis Allen set up the Department of History. In 1867, he became the first mentor to Frederick Jackson Turner and taught him the method of inquiry must be based on something other than perceptions and conception. It has to be based upon a scientific, analytic, and the model that William Francis Allen used was geology. Now, geology is one of the earliest sciences to be able to understand that in order to read the geological history, one has to apply oneself to experiments on many different levels, and out of this will come a refining capacity to then elevate your theory, and the elevation of the theory shows that it is not limited to the mind. It's not limited to the symbolic structure, that in fact a theory, the Greek is theoria, does not occur in the mind, it occurs in the field of vision. So that a theory is a visionary process, and the refinement takes place not in the individual who identifies themselves in their mind, I am I, and that this I is identified with the body, with what you do. You are what you do. You are what you eat. Only so far. We are much more. And so the theoria, the field of vision, is a conscious field that works like a fifth dimension, like a quintessential dimension, and allows for a prismatic person to displace the way in which one previously let her in. She's indecisive, and this will interrupt more than just coming in. You can see that attentiveness in almost any age is difficult. In the 21st century, it's impossible, and so we have to do something which is to expand the dimensions so that the impossible is possible. We used Wallace Stevens' poem, Asides on the Oboe, last week, where he said, "There is still the impossible possible philosopher's man, the man who has had the time to think enough, who still utters milky words by the flow of insight, and who in a million diamonds sums us up." This kaleidoscopic summing up is not a conclusion, but a furthering which continues to refine itself, and that is related to vision like the forms of conception are related to perception. But whereas in the integral, It is the forms that are correlate. In differential consciousness, it is the processes that are correlate, and the process that is correlate with vision is history. So when Frederick Jackson Turner, named for his father, who was also a Jackson Turner, an Andrew Jackson Turner, because it was Andrew Jackson historically who won the election of 1828, who changed radically the tone of the United States. And the tone of the United States is summed up in the fact that Andrew Jackson, when he took possession of the White House, rode his horse into the White House to take over. That new men who had nothing to do with Europe had everything to do with a new Western humanity called Americans, and we will be who we want to make ourselves to be, regardless of the past. And so it was a very interesting aspect for Frederick Jackson Turner to go to the University of Wisconsin and be shown that if you make your inquiry of history as a study based on a science like geology, you will be able to develop new theories, new tools that have almost never been applied before. And one of the summations of it after Turner had been dead for a while, Turner's methodology, multiple working hypotheses, and this is published by the Journal of American History. And in this, Turner learned that you get going an enormous array of materials, and you keep correlating them by refining your vision in allowing the expansion of consciousness. And then you correlate that with the refinement of your historical consciousness, that you not only expand the field of visionary consciousness, but you relate that visionary consciousness to the actuality of nature as a complementary field to vision, and you check it against the ultimate referential, which is not existence but the cosmos. And so what you're looking for here is to tune yourself so that as a prism, you emerge out of a conscious field of visionary possibility, and you look forward to a future where you will come closer and closer to an appreciation of how one fits not only into nature and those identifications of an integral mind, but that you become more and more at home in the cosmos, in the universe as a whole, which obviates then the mind's abstractionist disease, because it cannot abstract itself from what now is a deep complementarity, that nature and the cosmos, that consciousness and the mind, in their complementarities, like a pair of pairs, make a new square, which does not stay square, but it turns itself 90 degrees and becomes a diamond. And that square, that frame of reference, now is something other than a frame of reference. It becomes a composition that is outside of the frame of reference, yet related to it. And so one uses a phrase like I've used for the last 35, 40 years. You move from the square of attention, your frame of reference, to the diamond of insight, which is going beyond. And that diamond of insight not only goes beyond, it takes time with it, so it goes into a future that is possible, a future of all possible worlds. But it is a complementarity, so it has what they call in mathematics a recursive function. And that recursive function is that the past becomes renewed freshened, changed. And so one speaks of it then as the new past. And so the future and the new past are a tunable horizon that comes out of the resonances of visionary consciousness and the kaleidoscopic process of history. And when they pair together, when the square and the diamond come together, one gets a mandala. The Sanskrit term mandala doesn't mean a circle, it means the circumspection of the real. And so reality now emerges for the very first time as discoverable. And its discoverability is in such a way that the method has convinced you that you can continue to refine and learn indefinitely. One of Frederick Jackson Turner's great discoveries, after he finished most of his work at the University of Wisconsin, he went to the new Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore for a year, got his PhD, and came back to Wisconsin to teach there successfully for quite a number of years. He became world famous in 1893, coming down from Madison, from the University of Wisconsin, to Chicago. Chicago in 1893 brought the entire world together in what was called the World's Fair in the United States, but all over the rest of the planet, it was called the World's Parliament of Religions. Representatives of every religion on the planet came to Chicago together. It's the first time that a Hindu Swami came to the United States on an equal par with priests and ministers, and that Swami was Vivekananda, who brought Ramakrishna's genius and introduced, for the first time on a world stage, the sophistication of yoga and the incredible conscious insights of Vedanta. But also there were representatives of every religion, but the representative of the American Indian religions was a great Indian Sachem whose Algonquin name is Tatanga Mani. In English, it's Walking Buffalo. And Walking Buffalo is actually my spirit grandfather. He lived to be 97, and the movie Saskatchewan, starring Alan Ladd and Shelley Winters, actually has a clip of Tatanga Mani, of Walking Buffalo, and one gets to see the incredible vitality of him. What's interesting is that Walking Buffalo's parents were killed when he was a little boy, couple of years old, so he was adopted by a Scottish rancher named George McLean. But instead of taking McLean as his name, he always went by Walking Buffalo, especially after 1893. And at that World Parliament of Religions, Frederick Jackson Turner was one of the stars. And he presented a short little paper called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. That Americans are not just different from Europe, they are a new refinement of the species of man. Because their response is a response to the future, not a conformance to a past which was dead, and because they are correspondent, resonant to the future, the past is always renewable for them in new insights. And so the teaching of history, especially at the University of Wisconsin at that time, in the late 1890s, the early decade of the 20th century, became one of the star places in the world to learn what was later in Europe called the history of ideas, but actually is an inquiry into learning by an expanded consciousness. So successful was he that the most ambitious university in America wanted him. In fact, at the time was the most ambitious university in the world, Harvard. And so Frederick Jackson Turner went to Harvard in 1910 and was there until 1924. And when he retired, of course, he couldn't be retired. He was so world famous that he came to Los Angeles. He came to the Huntington Museum and Library and Art Gallery. And he was one of the heads of research at the Huntington until he died in 1932. In fact, the Huntington published, the Huntington has all the boxes of the papers of Frederick Jackson Turner, so that American history became the focus through Frederick Jackson Turner of the way in which one can begin to understand a fulcrum of the way in which civilization changed its nature, changed the expansive scalar by which it had been understood for thousands of years and was emerging into something that is truly kaleidoscopic. This volume, The Eloquence of Frederick Jackson Turner, published by the Huntington Library, it came out in 1983. My copy I got from compliments of Robert Middlecoff, director of the Huntington Library and Art Gallery. I had done a year's research on Benjamin Franklin and Henry David Thoreau at the Huntington at this time, preparatory to a book called Hermetic Roots of America. How we got from the Renaissance to the United States. Because the most powerful conception in the Renaissance, by far, was not only the relearning of what was forgotten about the classical past, a renaissance, a rebirth of learning, but complementary to that, the most powerful idea of the Renaissance for a future was the New World. And the discovery of the New World, codified in rote history as 1492, is exactly the time that the culmination of the refinement of classical learning in the Renaissance was brought to a pinnacle, because the great teacher, scholar, historian of the Renaissance, Marsilio Ficino in Florence, Italy, the Medici set him up in Fiesole, up on the mountain rim of Florence in the Via Caregi, which is still there. Beautiful old 500, 600-year-old yellow Italianate villa owned in our time by Lawrence Rockefeller, who was my patron for about 10 years. It is there in 1492 that Ficino brought his translations of Greek, which had been going on for 40 years, to a culmination. He published his translations of Plotinus. And Plotinus's Aeneads are the top of the pyramid of classical learning that went back thousands of years, and in terms of the Greek language, went all the way back to Homer, who was about 1,300 years before Plotinus. That, in terms of English, would be like someone summing up all of the wisdom from today all the way back to Beowulf in 700 AD. This is possible. It may even be happening. The English language is now refined enough to take its place with Sanskrit and Greek and other languages that have refined the ecology of consciousness with the cycle of nature, brought together in a complementarity that we know as reality. For us to become real, we must explore the frontier as the future and refine the past so that it is freshened again, so that it is able to be seen again. And one of the difficulties is that minds that are prosaic in only seeking identifications and close themselves off to vision will produce something which the classical Greeks at the very birth of history recognized. The birth of history in classical Greece was Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. And contemporaneous with Thucydides is the use of a art form called Greek tragedy to show that there is a tragic outcome inevitably out of the pride, out of the hubris of settling for identifications as the index of reality. Because the energies of nature will erupt like volcanic magma through that, and the storms of consciousness that has been ignored, instead of being an expansion, now become incursions. And Greek tragedy came to a pinnacle at the time of Thucydides, getting as far as he could in his history with the last great tragedy of the last great tragedian, Euripides, the Bacchae. Thucydides in his history establishing for the first time a science of history that is still profoundly here in American historians and historians of the whole planet by this time. At the beginnings of the 20th century, in the 1890s, it was largely a phenomenon that was only in Europe, at places like Vienna or London, or here in the United States. The difficulty, Thucydides said, knowing what we know now about man, about events, we are doomed to repeat it forever. All of this will happen again and again and again, because as long as we stay on the wheel of the cycle, it will come around again to the same places unless man learns to change, to transform. But he has to be wise, because most of the changes, if they're based on identifications, on just reforming what you think you know, what you're convinced that you know, instead of the cycle going on its same dull round, it augers in and becomes quicker. And instead of it taking 1,000 years, it might only take 100 years. If it really speeds up, it might take 10 years. And we live in a 21st century where we don't have the space of even 1 year to make the same mistakes that have been made over and over again. The change we need is a refining transform to the expansion, so that we have a vision which is open to as many human beings as possible, to as many men and women. And this takes a quality of their children, regardless of any other sociological conditions, geographical conditions, any other conditions, have an access to the ability to begin to get traction into the expansion, into the way in which one can learn to be at home in reality. This is responsible. This is what is conscious. This is what is life-giving. And so these are not lectures. These are presentations that fit into a resonance. And that seasonal resonance of 13 weeks was formulated at the end of the 1st century AD in Alexandria and exemplified in a series of 13 dialogues that hearkened to the Greek tragic dialogue, also hearkened to Thucydides' history, and saw that the resolution at the time were the dialogues of Plato, that instead of resulting in Greek tragedy, or occasionally the Greek comedy outcome of it, which is tragic because just laughing about it doesn't change the fact that tomorrow you may not laugh. In between tragedy and history, Plato's dialogues generated something that he was taught called philosophy, the love of wisdom, the love of learning. And Plato learned it from Socrates. And Socrates learned it from a woman named Diotima from Mantinea. And she learned it because she sat personally and heard Pythagoras, who's the first to call himself a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. And so philosophy is a quest for the real in terms of a history. Pythagoras said history is geometry. History is a geometry which transforms itself into not just taking the points and lines and planes of a mental structure, but factors in the relationships of the processes. And so geometry becomes a trigonometry. It becomes a function shape as well. And when one has a trigonometric understanding, the mind already has stepped out of a static shape into a dynamic shape, and that dynamic shape is only one realization away from what we call calculus. The ability to make an analytic to any degree of specificity that we want. It's called the infinitesimal calculus. And it has two different forms. It has an integral form, it has a differential form. And together they make a mathematics. So those who learned to listen to Pythagoras, the acousmatiki, became the people who have developed the discovery inquiry process of being able to vision and to historically, kaleidoscopically expand it so that one now becomes, the Greek phrase for the Pythagoreans was a mathematiki. One is able to discern the real for yourself to any degree of specificity, and instead of being reliant only on vague prophecies of the future, one can now work together to make the likely future that is best for all come into being, to prepare the ground for it, to share the vision of it, to calibrate the prismatic persons who really will do this, and to generate the kaleidoscopic history that actually puts it into play. And when it's put into play, the real does something truly magical. It invites us in our sense of reality and confirms and seals upon us the ability to be real. And in this way, the science of the cosmos refinedly, again and again, confirms that we belong at home in that real. The 13 parts of the Hermetica began with the Poimandres, the creative mind shepherd, and the 13th was called the rebirth. A series of dialogues that led from the beginnings of hearing a shepherd who could awaken us to the vision that would lead to the cosmic real, and made that resonant set by confirming to us that we are indeed rebirthable. And if we are rebirthable once, the technique is sealed and we're rebirthable indefinitely. This is called eternal life. Let's take a break. Let's come back to our sense that we're appreciating a set of presentations that will arrange in a set that will have the ability to have a harmonic which is extendable. We have been looking in the first half, before the break, at the way in which American history has progressively refined itself from the earliest presentations of it, which were largely European imitations, and that the first occurrence of a Hermetic America is in the figure and life, the prismatic person of Benjamin Franklin. There are even little children's action figures of Benjamin Franklin with his kite, discovering that nature is reachable in such a way that one can take one's house key and put it on a very simple child's play toy, a kite. And by coupling with that a vision modulated by a prismatic person to make an experiment in historical inquiry and tap the energy of the cosmos and bring lightning down and store it in an arrangement of jars made in Leiden, Holland, in the Netherlands. But Franklin is the first of them to arrange in a matrix a number of Leyden jars, and he made the world's first battery to store electrical power from nature so that it could be used and portioned out by man. This is akin to discovering fire. It's akin to discovering the way in which very quickly it led to the electrification of the world. And in less than 200 years, it led to the American, Hermetic American, penetrating to bring atomic fire into play for mankind. We've been talking about Frederick Jackson Turner, about the history department at the University of Wisconsin, because it is a formative place. The current Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison says that they have 800 undergraduate majors, several hundred graduate students, and it's one of the biggest programs and best, not only in the United States, but in the world. I started at the University of Wisconsin in Madison 50 years ago. Started because I wanted to be an engineer to build rockets. And because I had won a scholarship that paid for everything, my practical business father said, no, you can't go to MIT just because you want to go. And just because it's a good school. You have everything paid for you by the University of Wisconsin, you'll go there. And so I ended up there, and within less than half a semester realized that much more interesting than building rockets was maturing a kind of a person who could build those rockets. Was much more interesting. I went into philosophy and history. One of the most star history professors at the time was William Appleman Williams, an extraordinary figure. He had been in the Navy. He had been born in Iowa. He came to the University of Wisconsin and published there one of the seminal books of the 20th century in 1959, just as I was beginning to take courses from him, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. Followed a couple of years later by one of the most famous books in history, The Contours of American History. And when it first was published in 1962, it was reviled It was ridiculed. It was called something so unprofessional that it might even be a hoax. Years later, one of the great history professors at UCLA, Keith Berwick, wrote a review saying that the book had been misunderstood, and if you go to the website of Oregon State University, where the papers of William Appleman Williams are, 31 boxes of them, he is regarded to be the founder of the revisionist school of American diplomatic history, the author of several books. The Contours of American History was named one of the 100 best nonfiction books written in English in the 20th century. Like American science and literature, poetry, American history has been one of the pride achievements of this country over the last 300 years. And the prismatic document that gives us a calibration for the first time of what the harmonic might be in terms of a classic wisdom recognizable all the way back to Pythagoras and through him beyond into ancient wisdom, was Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And one finds he's writing his autobiography in London when he's already a world-famous mature man looking back on his life, but he puts a little diagram in the beginning of his autobiography, like a matrix of Leyden jars, meant to put his house key on a kite in a thunderstorm and bring electrical energy of lightning into a usable storage for man to electrify the world. The diagram in the autobiography is a Pythagorean technique of keeping track day by day by day of a set of qualities. Franklin used 14 because it's an ancient, classic, Hellenistic Jewish tradition. 14 is a pair of Sabbaths. If you look in the New Testament, Matthew begins right away of saying there are 3 sets of 14 generation units that lead to Jesus Christ from Abraham, through the middle of it, which is David. But the middle of it is not the middle of the 42, the 3 sets of 14, but is at the end of the first set of 14, making a millennium. But the second millennium is divided in the middle, 14 generations to the exile, and from the exile to Jesus, 14, so that you have right away a Pythagorean ratioing of time forms in Matthew to begin the New Testament. That it begins with an understanding this is not a tradition that is just remembered for some purpose, hopefully, that will happen. This is the way in which a geometry of time forms is able to be portioned out so that one begins to sensitize oneself to what I used to call, and still do, ratios of the real. William Appleman Williams, when he was teaching at the University of Wisconsin in the late 1950s, and his classes would draw 700 or 800 students at a time in B3, Bascom Hall 3, he had a peculiar technique. He would take off his coat and he would roam around and leave his notes and everything on the podium. But as he roamed around, the long cord to the mic attached to him would snake out taut, and he would walk almost to the end of the stage, and he would stop one step before he would pull the microphone over. And all of us taking notes, watching this, and we got to understand that what he said at that moment was going to be on the final exam, and if you were not able to hear him, you would not know the answer, because that's the only time it was ever mentioned. And so we used to watch him diligently, and when you watch someone diligently, you really hear what they're saying because you're trying to remember it all. It's an acting technique. The best example I ever saw was in a stage play, First Monday in October, about the first female Supreme Court judge. And Eve Marie Saint was on stage playing that, but Henry Fonda was playing one of his great characters. And I began to notice that just before he would deliver one of the great lines of the play, Fonda would stop his action for a split second, deliver the line, and then finish the action. He would go to sit down, he would make the line, and then he would finish sitting. It's that technique of the pause that refreshes. That you catch the eye, and then the ear follows in. And the appreciation then hears the music. This lifts language out of mythology into a poetic. And a poetic gives us then a prismatic capacity for music that would not be there otherwise, and that a Pythagorean music is understandable to the extent that one can tune it and make instruments now that are tunable. And instead of just having a harp eventually, you can have the octave repeated in increments and eventually have 11 octaves and make a piano. So that now you not only have a David who can sing before the Lord with all his might, but you have a Mozart who can compose so that one can actually hear a cosmic music, which has a distinctive personal tone. It isn't this or that tribe, it's Mozart. And once one has tuned one's ear to hear this, now a poetic language is able to expand a rhetorical structure of language, which always has a mythic basis of experience, always has a referential to existentials for its identities and identifications, whereas a poetic is a visionary dimensioned language that is able to look beyond. It looks more and more to the future for possible referentials, and so you get a spectrum of possibilities. And out of this comes something that a great friend of mine, Theodore Sturgeon, used to call, in fact, he entitled one of his most famous books, More Than Human. He won the International Fantasy Award in 1954. The hardcover edition was signed by Sturgeon for me, and just to flash it for a moment here, it is no rumor that Roger Weir is more than human. It's true. Theodore Sturgeon. There are classic editions, leather-bound and signed and so forth, of these sorts of things. What More Than Human is about is a gestalt humanity, and 55 years ago, it was the beginnings of trying to express that there are tunable groups of human beings who together make a prismatic spectrum. It is a different basis than individualism of community, which means that the politics transforms into a tunable, musical scalar of community, which is actually philosophically an aesthetic rather than a politic. The limitations of political economy occurred a long time ago, and just this week failed, even though they held all the aces. They held all the court cards, but they did not know that there were jokers in the deck. And consciousness is a trickster. You cannot put it where it is and expect that statically it will be assignably there. Jesus said, you hear the wind, but you don't know really where it came from or where it goes. All you know is that it blew here now. And if you think that that identification is the present, as a present moment, as a present point, you are trapped in an illusion. And believing it, you are living in a delusion, because there is no present point. There is a presence that is dynamic and is a complex continuity of many dimensions. This is what is real. Someone like William Appleman Williams, after the misreceiving of contours of American history, of him being brought into question of whether he was really all there in the 60s, he finally left the University of Wisconsin and went to Oregon State. But in doing so, he published one of the great critiques of the late 1960s, which in Hermetic America is the most profound decade, only exceeding that of the 1940s, barely. His book in 1969, The Roots of the Modern American Empire, a study of the growth and shaping of a social consciousness in a marketplace society. I won't go into all of the quotations and realizations here, but he says that the beginnings of this came in the 1880s, when you had the age of the robber barons, when you had what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, when you had something that was already from the beginnings of America, from the beginnings of the United States, the need to compete on world-scale markets because those that you were competing against already had empires like the British or the Spanish or the French. And so it was racing and running to get into parity with the competition. And one of the most successful American businesses, industrial concerns to do that, was American whaling ships. In Melville's Moby Dick, published in 1851, but based back into the 1840s, of men who had already been out on the oceans of the world for a whole generation. One of the old New Bedford men, Stubb, second mate on the Pequod, said, "The oceans of the world belong to us, Nantucketers. We go wherever we want to go on the globe, on the oceans of the world. And we are the ones who hunt the strongest, most mysterious creature on the planet, the whale." He says to Ishmael, glaring at him under one of the swaying lights, "Mark me, if God had wanted to be a fish, he'd be a whale." And paradoxically, of course, the whale, the white whale, the injured, scrunched Moby Dick, is the one who kills all, sinks the Pequod, except for Ishmael, again, rescued by a ship looking for its lost crewmen, only to find another orphan, he says. This quality of Moby Dick was replayed in the late 1960s. It was replayed in 1968, and it was replayed in a peculiar phenomenon witnessed by only about a dozen of us in person. The World Science Fiction Convention in 1968 was in Berkeley, California, was at the grand old Claremont Hotel, and the guest of honor was Ray Bradbury. who was late to such an extent that the convention day was over and there were just a few diehards, less than a dozen of us, still visioning together. We'd known each other since 10 years in the University of Wisconsin, where we were politically active in the anti-Nixon campaign. And in comes Ray Bradbury about midnight, carrying a nice little case with a tape recorder machine. And he said, I have been unable until now to finally get my artistic consciousness cleared, because I was seized by John Huston to do the screenplay for Moby Dick for him. And he managed to get me over to his little estate in Ireland, and I didn't realize that Huston is a really tough guy. I was not allowed to leave Ireland. I was not allowed to go out of the estate till I finished the screenplay. So he did, but he said, I got Melville in my blood. I couldn't get him out. I got Melville's Moby Dick in my image base. I couldn't exercise him. And so it suddenly occurred to me that the only thing I could do was take a kind of advice that Lawrence Durrell once said about his Alexandria Quartet. There are some women that you cannot forget, and you will die because they're gone. There are some women that you would like to know and you can't. You never will. The only thing to do with this condition is to make a work of literature where they all can live and you can find a way to express and bring yourself back into life. So Bradbury wrote a science fiction version of Moby Dick. He called it Leviathan 99, of a spaceship captain pursuing a maelstrom whirlpool that was haunting, almost like a Star Trek episode from later times. And he said, I had to write it as a radio play, that was the form, but there was no network in the United States. So he had to take it to England, to BBC, to have it produced. And he brought the first recording of it on tape in the little machine. And until about 2:30, 3 in the morning, we sat around this little campfire of future visioning, of deep Hermetic American understanding and transforms, and enjoyed this. I'll bring next week my copy of The Martian Chronicles, signed that night, that early morning by Ray, with 3 exclamation marks for Roger, who made it. This quality of science fiction is a very strong American, Hermetic American dimension, and it began to take shape in the 1930s. In 1933 through 1935, all of the Buck Rogers Sunday comic strips were collected together in one of the first comic books ever published. And this is from 1935. This is the first edition of Buck Rogers in the 25th century. And his nemesis is named Killer Kane, who runs a very tight empire and who does not brook anyone bucking him for a moment, because you cannot do this. And one of the themes of William Appleman Williams is that the course of empire always dogs and shadows the developments of human capacity to grab them, to suck them dry, to co-opt them, to bring them into their closed cycle, which tends, as we have discussed, as we have visioned, as we have come to understand historically, the few tend to become fewer. The second issue of Buck Rogers came in 1941, and we'll talk in presentation 13 next week about the significance of 1941, 1942, 1943. Those years set an enormous trigger focused in the United States that was pulled in 1945 by the detonation successfully of not only the first atomic bomb, but even before a month was out, an atomic bomb in Hiroshima, a third in Nagasaki, and others readied in a military-industrial complex certainty that we have the hammer by which to break any mold possible, and we intend to use it. We not only will use it, we are using it. You better beware. And of course, the response is always that there are others. This is the 1942 all-flash quarterly, The Flash, the fastest man alive. And it's from 1943 on that you hear American fighter pilots vying with each other to be the fastest man alive. And of course, the great figure in that was Chuck Yeager, who on my 7th birthday, October 14th, 1947, broke the sound barrier in the X-1. And he was touted everywhere as the fastest man alive. And he was that for many years until Major Kehoe broke a Mach 2 sound barrier in a bigger jet and became Scott Crossfield became the fastest man alive. The most significant figure, though, at the time in these comic books, not the Flash, not Superman, not Batman. The recursion this year of going back to Batman is a mythological, ingrown curlicue. Wonder Woman is the most significant figure in the golden age of comics, which went along with the golden age of science fiction. And she belongs, like Superman and Batman and the Flash, in the golden age of science fiction that comes to a mature, expressive, prismatic stance by 1939, and it extends all the way for 10 years to 1949. And you find in that decade the most remarkable surge of visionary capacity for Hermetic America to begin to explore and review all possible worlds. An incredible decade and era. This is the third issue of Wonder Woman, and when one takes a look, this is the 10th issue of Wonder Woman, and inside are all the people who advise on the writing and styles of Wonder Woman. Included is Pearl Buck, Nobel Prize winner for literature, Alice Marble, who was at the time the tennis champion of the world for women, Henrietta Bender at York University School of Medicine, and so on and so forth. What's interesting, and we'll get to this next week, is that these invaders from Saturn in issue number 10, the whole issue, fall of 1944, reads like the alien challenge of the UFO community in the latter part of the 20th century. All of it is here, and it's no accident whatsoever. I want to show a couple of illustrations. This is what Theodore Sturgeon looked like. This is his self-portrait that he gave me. And you can take a look at it closer later. When I came back from teaching in Canada for 5 years, I eventually settled into teaching at the Philosophic Research Society, our Benjamin Franklin version here in Los Angeles of the American Philosophical Society. And every summer solstice to celebrate the beginnings of doing that, Theodore Sturgeon helped me run the summer solstice programs. Sometimes we did far-out presentations, and after he unfortunately passed away, he had a bronchial condition, and when he was lecturing in Hawaii, the humidity got to him, and he literally suffocated before they could get him back to a different climate, and he passed on. So in 1986, the last of those 6 summer solstice celebrations, I wrote a short science fiction story, and I'll bring next week, Theodore in Winter, about a planet that only has an experimental station on it and is manned just in case by an experimental robot named Theodore. And things go wrong. And it's only later when human beings come back to reconnoiter that they find the robot with a scrolled little piece of paper stuck like a cigar in its voice box, holding a knife and a bandolero of cartridges which it had manufactured, staring at the station that will not let it back in. And in reviewing it, the story unfolds. Robots became a prize feature in 1940. This is the September 1940 issue of Super Science Stories. The editor, Frederick Pohl, retitled the story as Strange Playfellow, but the title always has been Robbie. And Robbie is the first story in a book called I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. And it's the way in which the 3 laws of robotics were first introduced, and introduced because Robbie is the future way in which one can ensure the maturation of a human being into almost unlimited powers, because the robot will have almost no limitations. And later on in 1956, the film Forbidden Planet, the creative robot there was named Robbie. The movement of science fiction at that time became extremely rapid. Robert Heinlein became one of the great figures within a couple of years. This is beyond this horizon. He took a pen name, Anson MacDonald, April 1942. This is a very strange alien craft among the sequoias of Sequoia National Park. We'll talk more about this next week. The Asimov genius was not limited just to robot stories, but he published a story in 1940 called Foundation, about a future galactic empire that was falling apart because the empires always fall apart. And the problem was how to get a new empire working, and the computation of psychohistorians is that it would take 30,000 years. Whereas the Foundation was set up to shrink the time to 1,000 years. But unbeknownst to them, a mutant appears called the Mule, who says, we don't have to wait 1,000 years, I'm here now. We're going to have something that I make. And becomes surprised because the contingency in the 3rd volume, it's a trilogy, it set the tone for trilogies in science fiction. Foundation is the 1st volume. Foundation and Empire is the 2nd. And the 3rd is called Second Foundation, that on the other side of the galaxy, a secret 2nd foundation was instituted so that the 1st foundation would never be able to reassemble itself in such a way that it then in some future time would fail. And the 2nd foundation needs to deal then with the Mule, who has found a new way to make empires. So the 2nd foundation has to reformulate itself so that it does not function as just a shadow anymore. And the Mule brings out something new. The 2nd part of Foundation was called Bridle and Saddle, June 1942. Almost every month was coming out, and in December 1942, the Weapon Shops by A.E. Van Vogt was published about super science weaponry. And in February of 1943, a couple of months later, The Weapon Makers. And it is the writings of A.E. Van Vogt that are at the pinnacle of a transformation of science fiction at the beginnings of the Golden Age. And we talked last week about Black Destroyer. The stealing of that plot was one of the bases for the film Alien decades later, for which they paid eventually. But The Weapon Makers and the Weapon Shops of Ishur is about an immortal man, Robert Hedrock, who over millennia literally makes the conditions for a new quality of mankind to transcend the species. And that this new species will indeed not only be more than human, but will be more than aliens. That they have gone as far as they can go, but Hermetic Americans have not gone as far as they can go. They're not going to stop with Kansas City. They're going to go on to new horizons beyond this horizon. One of the qualities that is peculiar. Here's a 1995 issue of Wonder Woman, and you can see the garishness of how a regression has entered into play. It is no longer Pearl Buck and concerned people writing a new kind of story for children who are meant to explore the whole universe. But here is an opportunism to characterize some kind of a game figure and to leave it at that. The portrait of A.E. Van Vogt is quite interesting because as the first of the great writers for the golden age of science fiction, actually was from Manitoba. He was Canadian. But all of his great career was spent here in Los Angeles. And in fact, when I published my book, Our New Aeon, his surviving wife, Lydia, was one of the first to get a copy of my book, Our New Aeon. That was in 2001. The peculiar thing is that in the days before I got to be a would-be rocket engineer, the first imprint of Roger Weir is in the original science fiction, May of 1957. And it was a letter, and apparently the letter was lost, and so the editor made an appeal, which I'll read. What's interesting is that there are two letters in the letter column of May 1957. One is by Isaac Asimov, and one is by Roger Weir. After Asimov's, Dear Bob, the editor was Robert Lowndes, one of the founders of the Futurians in New York City, along with Asimov and Pohl and Donald Wollheim and many others. How do you do? I'm Roger Weir. In my opinion, SFS, Science Fiction Stories, has become an example of what a science fiction magazine can, with a good editor at the helm, bring itself up to. Issue after issue, Science Fiction Stories has shown small but steady improvements. The September 1956 issue of SFS is right here beside me, and beside it is the September 1955 issue. Improvement, 16 more pages, better percentage of enjoyable stories, covers are both good. I am finding Simak, Clifford Simak was the editor of the Minneapolis Star newspaper and one of the great figures in golden age of science fiction. I am finding Simak's stories some of the best now being written. He is at the present time in the 8th place in my rating of the top 10 science fiction writers. Theodore Sturgeon is number 7. I have nearly all 1937, 38, 39 issues of National Geographic magazine that I would like to trade for back issues of science fiction magazines. Preferred are the 1940-1950 issues of thrilling wonder stories, startling stories, astounding planet stories, and super science stories. Also, I would like to trade for some mentioned or others various issues of National Geographic from the middle 40s, Popular Mechanics from the late 40s. All magazines have covers. I will also trade big little books. How about a debate topic? I say that time travel, except mentally, is impossible. I think I can prove this. Let's choose up sides. All cons, not X. Follow me towards victory. Roger A. Weir. My humble apologies, Roger, for misplacing your letter, losing your address. Tell you what, suppose you write me and let me know your current address. Anyone who'd like to trade with you can write this magazine. I'll forward their letters. And had I have realized that it was published, probably would not have gone on to a university education. More next week.